We just want to welcome everyone for being on today. I'm Kelsey Schmitz, and I work for the University of Washington at the SMART Center, the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center, and I'm the School Mental Health Lead for the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. This webinar today is the second in a series that we're doing on anxiety in schools. We're also thrilled today to announce part 3, which will be a live Q&A with Kendra and Jen, who will be our subject matter experts. That will happen on December 9th at 1 o'clock. Our funder, SAMHSA, has asked that we provide a disclaimer that the views, opinions, and content expressed in the presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, SAMHSA, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So the University of Washington SMART Center and the Northwest MHTTC acknowledge that we live, learn, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. We're grateful to respectfully live and work as guests on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. We encourage you to learn about the ancestral lands that you are joining us from today. So many of you who have joined our webinars before could probably give this introduction, but just a reminder to people who are new or people that may have forgotten, we are a SAMHSA-funded project, and we were funded in late 2018. The Mental Health Technology Transfer Center network includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. Our Region 10 Center serves the states of Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. We know that we have many of you that are joining us from outside of our region, which is great, but we also want to ensure that you know that in your region you have a school mental health lead as well as an overall mental health technology transfer center network that you can reach out to for additional training and technical assistance. All right, next slide. So as I mentioned, we serve Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And our focus is on providing training and technical assistance to the school mental health workforce. This slide can give you information about how to get in touch with our team, how to sign up for our newsletter, visit our website that has other resources, and if you're on social media, we encourage you to connect with us too. We also send out monthly newsletters as well as training and resource blasts, so we hope that you'll take the time to sign up for our newsletter as well. And at this point, I want to pass it on to our speakers for today. So I am going to hand things off to Dr. Kendra Reed, who is with the Seattle Children's Hospital, and her colleague, Dr. Jennifer Blossom, who's now at the University of Maine at Farmington. Hello, Kendra. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Kelsey, for that introduction. And thank you all for taking the time out of your very, very busy schedules to join us for this webinar. Jen and I are both very passionate about the work that we do, and we are so excited to be able to share some ideas and problem solve with you here today. So this second part, we'll be talking about managing anxiety during COVID specifically, something that is high on everybody's mind, I'm sure. With that in mind, I'll just launch right in. As a reminder, we don't have any conflicts of interest, nor will we be discussing any off-label product use. This presentation has no commercial support or sponsors. It's not co-sponsored. This is just information that Jen and I know and have researched for a long time. In terms of our learning objectives for today, our goals are to discuss and help you all distinguish typical versus problematic anxiety within educational settings, both in person and remote formats during a global pandemic, which is a new setting for most of us. We will be talking about applying evidence-based strategies for anxiety in these situations as an educator, recognizing that many of you have different roles within your settings. So we can talk about the nuances of that as well. We'll be talking about how to learn to promote use of evidence-based strategies for anxiety within your educational setting. We certainly heard from some of you at the last talk that many of you loved what we had to say and felt like it was hard given your position in your school to promote that. So we can talk about that. And we'll also be talking about how to understand the implementation of effective anxiety coping strategies that can promote resilience. So those are our goals for today. We wanted to start off with some review from part 1 of our seminar. So these are the key points that Jen and I wanted everybody to make sure they came away with from the first part. Now, as Kelsey mentioned, the first part is recorded. You can access that and go back and look at what we had to say in greater depth. So these are really boiled down. The first point is about approach. So the most important way to help kids with problematic anxiety is to help them approach anxiety-provoking situations, to help them find manageable steps, to help them work toward facing their fear instead of avoiding. Another point that we have is, sounds contraindicated, but is about avoiding. There are some things that we want caregivers and educators to avoid doing that actually mean that we're falling into a trap when it comes to problematic anxiety for youth. And those things involve offering excessive reassurance, distractions, or any accommodations that promote avoiding. So we really want to help kids face the things that they find anxiety provoking, as hard as that sounds. And we just wanted to again reiterate some of the things that are not harmful, but they are not helpful, and that they are not the critical pieces of intervention for youth with anxiety. And this is really important to us because what we often find is that when Jen and I meet with local schools, a lot of people, really good, well-meaning providers and educators are wanting to promote strategies like relaxation strategies or journaling, because on face value, it seems to make a lot of sense, but we're missing the key elements of exposure or approaching and facing our fears. So again, these things are not tied to treatment outcome. So they are not contributing to youth improving their coping with anxiety. And often, especially the relaxation strategies, these send very conflicting messages about the harm of those somatic symptoms or bodily symptoms of anxiety. Because as we talked about at the first seminar, we really emphasized that anxiety is a totally normal, natural emotion we all experience. So if we are saying that, and then we're saying, calm your body down, take those deep breaths, not only do we have research to show that that doesn't actually help, but we also know that that sends a very conflicting message to youth, and then it starts to contribute to an increased fear or worry about those bodily symptoms of anxiety. So instead, we want kids to ride the wave of those symptoms. What goes up must come down. And so we want to help them ride that wave and see that there's a crest to that wave and it comes down on the other side. Okay. So that's just a review from last time. We're going to jump right into the bulk of what we want to talk about today, which is anxiety within the COVID-19 pandemic. So as it comes to COVID and youth mental health, we know, as I was mentioning, that anxiety, especially anticipatory anxiety, is a common reaction in a crisis. So here again, we want to acknowledge that there's typical anxiety, and then there's problematic anxiety. And this is pretty hard to distinguish during a pandemic, where it would be completely understandable that when people are getting sick around you, when there are impacts from the stay-at-home orders that are directly impacting your family or your way of life, that there is a great deal of anxiety around this. And that may not be problematic anxiety. It may be totally expected anxiety. So we can expect anxiety in reaction to a crisis. And we know that this pandemic has caused a lot of uncertainty for people. I mean, even just talking about when we might return to school or work in person, there's a great deal of uncertainty, especially as we head into the fall. So there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot that's not in our control. And that can be incredibly anxiety provoking for all of us. So one of the things that is really important to acknowledge is just the importance of validating that fact that if you are experiencing anxiety during this worldwide pandemic, you have a functioning sympathetic nervous system. Of course you're experiencing anxiety. It makes complete sense why that's the case. And if that anxiety is starting to impact functioning, in that you're so distressed or so absorbed by your worry, or you're having to engage in behaviors that are far outside what our best scientists and medical experts are recommending, that it's impacting your life, you can't do the things you need to do, given the restrictions, then we're starting to talk about problematic anxiety. So as it comes to COVID-19 and mental health, we also anticipate that the impacts of the stay-at-home orders, of like all of the pieces of the COVID-19 pandemic, we would anticipate that there would be some long-term mental health impact of this, particularly anxiety on youth because of these related restrictions. Like they might be worried about contracting the illness. There are some impacts due to the isolation from the quarantine restrictions. Sorry, my leg fell asleep. They're having less kind of social reference with peers to know like, oh, like other people are experiencing the same thing about this. Other people seem to be not quite getting this math problem. Like we're all in our Brady Bunch squares on Zoom. So it's hard to have that social reference to understand like where people, if they're feeling alone, if other people are in the same boat. And we're just we're social creatures. We're not getting that need met a lot of the time. There are impacts on social determinants of health. So things like food insecurity, unemployment, housing insecurity, access to appropriate health care, access to mental health care. There's some real barriers given how everything has happened with COVID, and impact on typical developmental trajectories. So as I mentioned, that social piece, so thinking about kids and their need to engage with other kids socially and develop those social skills, the isolation and the quarantine restrictions may have impacts on those types of developmental trajectories. Okay, and at this point, I'm going to hand it back over to Jen Blossom.
Okay, thank you, Kendra. So as Kendra was saying and setting the stage, for most, if not all of us, we are navigating a new environment, a new short-term, ideally, reality with the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the things that we wanted to make sure to talk about today, especially when we start to think about how to support students who might be experiencing anxiety related to COVID, is how important it is to make sure that we're being culturally responsive and culturally sensitive to the impact of COVID. And part of that requires recognizing that there is a disproportionate impact of COVID-19, particularly on communities of color. We see significantly higher risks of mortality associated with COVID-19. As you can see on the slide here, in particular, Indigenous peoples have experienced an increased risk of mortality up to 6 times higher relative to white people. And that in the last, in this year alone, we're not even through it. I'm trying to fast forward us to the end of December already because of what 2020 has done. But in the first few months of 2020, and if you see that second bullet point there, I'd like to highlight that this statistic was generated even a few months ago. So in 2020 alone, the rate of death among communities of color has skyrocketed relative to the previous 5 years. And what we're seeing is that, again, communities of color are particularly at risk of facing some of the most severe consequences of COVID-19. That means that objectively, the risk of facing death or facing significant health crisis associated with COVID-19 is higher for these communities and for these youth as well. What we're seeing is that, particularly for Black and Latinx youth, that there's a higher risk that they are likely to test positive for COVID-19, and that there's an increased risk that these youth would be hospitalized for COVID-19. So again, when we think about anxiety, going back to the recap that Kendra just described from our first talk, anxiety is an adaptive and typical emotion. It's helpful in many situations. When we're thinking about anxiety from a clinical lens, our goal is to better understand what's problematic anxiety versus what might be more typical anxiety. And part of distinguishing that is ensuring to understand what is the objective threat relative to individuals from different backgrounds. Great. What we've seen beyond the objective health and kind of mortality and physical threat of COVID-19 on communities of color, we've also observed that there are significant disruption to the safety and stability of those communities. So again, going back to the way we think about anxiety and how anxiety helps us, anxiety cues us if that there are issues in the environment that are telling us that we may not be safe, that we're at higher risk in certain situations. And what we've seen is that some of the secondary effects of COVID, so outside of directly contracting the illness or concerns about contracting the illness, what we're seeing is that communities of color, once again, are bearing the brunt of the response to COVID, in particular, some of the closings and shutdowns of businesses, where there's been significantly higher rates of businesses closed from Black and Latinx owned businesses relative to white owned businesses. We're seeing significant discrepancies in rate of unemployment, particularly impacting communities of color. And not unsurprisingly, when we consider those statistics, that by June, and again, we're now into October, so some of these statistics are even a couple of months outdated, that by June of 2020, that Black and Latinx renters were at risk of not being able to pay their rent at a much significantly higher rate than individuals renting who were white. And what this means, again, when we think about taking a step back, how we think about these numbers and the impact of COVID-19, what that means is that there's been disproportionate impact on our communities. Certainly, as Kendra just described, for all of us, COVID-19 has increased uncertainty, that we're constantly in a changing environment, and some of the most salient risks to the safety and stability that impact day-to-day functioning, like knowing if you are going to have breakfast in the morning, knowing if you are going to have a safe place to sleep at night, has disproportionately affected communities of color. So when we think about when we think about how we support our kids with COVID anxiety, it is important to recognize whether we're thinking about this risk from a culturally responsive lens again. So Kendra, if you could forward to the next slide there.
Yeah, Jen, we actually had a couple questions come in that I thought made sense to address while we're on the topic. Just clarifications, if that's okay. So one was, is there a percentage for 2020 death rate for Native America or Alaska Native populations?
I believe that those statistics are available, yes. And I have a great resource that highlights in one place, points to the statistics that can then take you to the primary resources that highlight this inequity and the specific statistics that I'm presenting today.
Great, so I'm sure Jen can collect that and send that out once I take back over. And another one was just a clarification. Was it 6 times higher for Indigenous peoples, American Indian / Alaska Native?
Yes. So that rate includes Indigenous people within the 48 contiguous United States, as well as Alaska Native populations.
Thanks,
Thank
Jen.
you for clarifying. Okay, so I've started to talk about this a little already, but what this means is that it's really important that when we are talking with our students, when we're trying to support our kids about thinking about anxiety and how they're managing and thinking about COVID, that we need to understand that these objective risks are different for different communities. And that means that the way that we would think about handling or supporting our student related to some of these risks may differ. And again, that's because we need to be particularly responsive and sensitive to the fact that these risks are different. In particular, one of the things that we think about, and one of the reasons why Kendra and I were so excited to come and talk to you all about this, and so excited that there was such enthusiasm for our last talk and for this talk, is that in anticipation of the mental health consequence, that mental health cascade, if you will, that Kendra just talked about a few slides ago, what we know is that because of some of these risks that I was just talking about, how they disproportionately affect our youth of color, that these are the same youth who already face enormous barriers to care, which means that this is exacerbating that they are objectively going to be at higher risk of experiencing mental health consequences as a result of COVID, while they are concurrently experiencing greater barriers to treatment. And this is one of the reasons why Kendra and I are so excited to do talks like this, because one of the ways that we can start to address this, to make sure that we are actively working to engage to address inequity in this access and disproportionate representation in treatment, is by making sure that these skills and the understanding of how we treat anxiety and support our students and youth with anxiety is available to those people like all of you who interact with these students on a regular basis. So you'll see you'll have the slides available. So I know we're gonna only talk through this graph pretty quickly, but again, you'll have this slide, and this is a really handy tool to start to think about. Does this idea of exposure and approach, what Kendra was just highlighting as a review from our discussion last time, does that make sense based on the given situation? And as you can see just at the top there, the first question is, how realistic is the situation? And part of that decision making must be informed by all of those important factors that I was just describing, and some of which I wasn't able to even talk about today. But really important to initially think about objectively what's going on in our students' lives, what's happening for them right now, and does it make sense that we should help them work towards brave practice? Is this something that we want them to be able to do? If we think about a kind of key example of this, if we take a step back and think about how disruptive COVID has been to learning, and that many of our students, myself as a new professor included, are engaging in this new platform of learning, thinking about how we're trying to connect via Zoom, and how challenging that can be for all of us. That's certainly difficult, and there can be a lot of naturally occurring anxieties about that. Worry about, what if I don't mute myself and I end up saying something silly while people can hear me? Or what if people see me on video and I don't realize that, I have a marker on my head or something like that? There's a lot of things that could come up that are amplified because of this unique kind of COVID-19 learning environment. And what we know is that while it is hard to manage, that avoiding participation, so delaying the start of the Zoom class or taking a day off from school, is not going to make those worries better. And in fact, it's likely going to make them worse, because now, and again, the details of this kind of phenomenon we covered a lot in our last talk. So please, if you didn't have a chance to attend that one, please make sure to review those resources. But what we know is that if we avoid when we feel anxious, it just makes it that much harder to get back into the situation. So for things like that, the example I just described, we would definitely want to focus on that first pathway. Do the brave practice, face the feared situation, so that our kids can learn what they're worried about is not likely to happen, or if it did happen, it wasn't as bad as they thought. Meanwhile, going back to some of the other ideas that I was talking about, again, thinking about that initial question right at the top of that at that graphic there, if we think about the fear as something that is more realistic for our students, that there is a situation where objectively they are at higher risk of coming in contact with somebody who has COVID or at risk of getting COVID themselves, then we want to think about what's the situation and should we help them come up with a plan to manage that. There's some examples there of what that might look like, versus if it's a situation that we would not expect based on their age, based on the information about the specific situation that's making them anxious or nervous that we would not expect them to know to deal with, then we're not asking them to do that. The goal of exposure is not to put people in objective risk situations, in objectively dangerous situations. The goal of exposure is to help people face fears that are getting in the way of things that they want or need to do, like logged into that Zoom class, like participating and getting a chance to have some time with peers, even if it's in an unpreferred format over Zoom. So one of the we just talking about a lot of very serious things, a lot of kind of difficult situations and things for us to think about. One of the things that I am so appreciative of getting to talk about these ideas with you all is that it gives me hope to think about what an impact we can have, particularly on inequity, when we can think about implementing these strategies more broadly by just making sure that the people who are seeing our kids, working with our kids in day-to-day life, have an opportunity to learn some of these skills and approaches and then support our students. That is a significant way of addressing some of the inequity that we're seeing. And particularly when we think about the school setting, and I use that term very broadly, so even if that is in the brick and mortar school, if that is via a Zoom online platform, that there are many naturally occurring opportunities to help kids practice common fears. And we're going to start to talk about some of those examples based on questions that we received last time from the first part of this webinar series about what some of those specific practice elements might look like.
Great. Thanks so much, Jen. So we wanted to give some more specific examples for you all. And this, again, is not an exhaustive list. So feel free, if you have specific situations or questions as we go through this that aren't represented here, feel free to use that Q&A function so that we can address that, because we will, just checking the time, we will definitely have a good chunk of time here to address your questions. So in terms of some common fears and exposures, you see there we have a chart here. And I think the key thing that I want all of you to know is that we want an exposure that kind of targets the specific fear or worry or situation that's being avoided, that's going on for that particular student. So Jen and I have a ton of kind of standard exposures, but it's hard to know if they're going to work for the specific student you're going to work with, because you just need to do a little mini assessment about what is it that they're afraid is going to happen and what is it that they're avoiding or maybe subtly avoiding by like overdoing certain behaviors. So the top one here has to do with fear of negative evaluation by others. And so there are a lot of example exposures here. So being on Zoom, with the camera on, we are tackling that a whole lot in our anxiety program right now. Even just attending the anxiety group, but also making sure that your camera is on for across different classes, because we know that, certainly as you've hit middle school and high school, there can be some different responses to different teachers, and different classes might be then more difficult to be, physically present for. We have them practice making a mistake in a social setting. So that could be something like giving the wrong answer, like raising your hand and giving the wrong answer, or raising your hand to ask a question in class just to draw attention to yourself. When we're meeting in person with youth, there are a ton of exposures that we do in this vein to just draw attention to say, like, people are now looking at you. They are acknowledging that you exist and you are here. Do we know for sure what they're thinking? And the answer is no. none of us can read minds. We don't know what other people are thinking about us. So even if people thought something negative about us, never told us, how could it really impact our lives? Just kind of challenging the gravity of other people's opinions of us. We can help them gradually increase their speech or engagement in meeting with new people, or even the peers that they have gone to school with for a long time but just aren't engaged with. So that might mean increasing speech or engagement within the classroom setting as much as is possible, thinking about how we weave that in to what's happening academically in the class, and also thinking about what opportunities might be available outside of that class. There are certainly schools, I'm seeing schools do a lot of creative things. So partnering like a study buddy moment at some point in the class, so that there's like a peer-to-peer breakout session, so they have a chance to connect with another peer socially, which they have very few, if any, chances to do these days. So there are a lot of exposures like that where we can connect them together, help them approach, and help them increase engagement in those settings. Another fear might be around separation. So this is, we can have, it just depends on what kind of setting you're in. So sometimes this, as many of you know, this can impact youth, even getting to the classroom when you're meeting in that brick and mortar setting. So having them sit independently, but you can also think about how this can apply to them at home. So we can have parents step outside of the room while they're in class with you. So they are, for all intents and purposes, attending class independently. And yes, they're at home, and it's not a perfect corollary, but it's as close as we can get. So finding little moments of separation. And if you have opportunity to collaborate with parents, encouraging parents to do moments where, parents are, depending on the age of the kid, the child can stay home alone for a period of time. And so the parent can go walk around the block and then come back and or even, spend time in different areas of the house with their apart. That can be really hard for many of our youth. So those are some examples of some separation exposures. Fear of making mistakes. I think this is a common one. I mean, I experience this fear all the time, probably leading up to this webinar. And the key exposure here is to practice making mistakes. We make mistakes constantly. How many mistakes have I already made during this presentation? Probably a handful, right? Because I'm a human being and we all make mistakes. So we have kids answer a question incorrectly on purpose. We do a lot of popcorn trivia in our anxiety groups. So there's less gravity to just a trivia game. It doesn't count for a grade. But even more important to apply it to these situations where there is a consequence. And we can say, what is the relative weight of this mistake? If we live in fear of mistakes, we're going to stop doing things because the mistakes are inevitable. So that might be a verbal mistake, like answering a question out loud, or sending something in on a homework, or turning something in a little bit late. It's not to teach them to always be wrong or always be late. It's to teach them that the fear that they have of what the consequences are of these small mistakes far outweighs what actually happens. We need to recalibrate that alarm system. Another thing that comes up a lot, and I think this came up a lot in the past seminar, was we got a lot of questions and feedback around the information we gave around relaxation strategies and how they're really not recommended. And so there were a lot of questions of well, what do we do when kids have a lot of physical symptoms of anxiety? And the key thing really is to help them stay in the moment and ride the wave, as I spoke about at the beginning. And we can even do specific exposures called interoceptive exposures that on purpose bring about that physical symptom of anxiety to help them see they're more in control because they're bringing it about themselves, but seeing that there's no, they can handle this, and they're it comes and it goes. Like I said, there's the wave. And the catastrophic consequence that they are assuming will happen is not as likely to happen. So we do things like, depending on what the physical symptom is that really bugs them, we have them like spin in a chair, like those spinny chairs. We can do like a jumping jack competition to get their heart rate up. So it's like their heart's beating really fast, like when you feel really anxious, or run stairs, or just like, step up and down one stair. We can breathe through a straw for 30 seconds or a minute. We can over breathe for 30 seconds to a minute. There are several different things. You could stare at a blank wall for 2 minutes. That one's actually really hard. That's hard to get that one kind of hitting the mark for a lot of our youth. But the point is the same, that we want them to approach that physical symptom to say like, hey, like, is it as bad as I think it is? And that is so much more in line with what we know that are the mechanisms of change in problematic anxiety than relaxation skills, which help kids avoid that physical symptom rather than helping them see like, oh, this physical symptom isn't something that I need to fear and is something that will come and go and I can cope with. So the key message for any exposure is to, as the kind of cheerleader, support person, teacher, counselor, whatever role you might have, parent for some of you, is really this combination of validation and confidence. And I think we talked about this last time, but it can't be understated that when we think about supporting youth with anxiety, we want to come at this with the framework of, I know this is hard and I know you can do it. A lot of times when we think about supporting youth with anxiety, it seems like people might interpret that as helping to accommodate anxiety by removing them from anxiety-provoking situations. Or so that's like just on the validation side of like, oh, this is really hard. This is too hard, right? Or sometimes we see people get stuck on just the confidence side of like, I mean, I don't think any of you would say this specifically, but the suck it up kid, I know you can do it, just get in there. Neither of those approaches are helpful. And so we really need that combination of like recognizing that this is hard and verbally and with your body language, emphasizing confidence that they can do hard things. So as I said, there are a ton more other categories of fears and worries than we had room to list. So if you have questions, and I see some popping up in the Q&A, feel free to list them there. Many of you are teaching by Zoom. So we wanted to take a minute just to think about how you support students by Zoom or any other web-based platform. We're not sponsored by Zoom, I don't think. But how you support students from a web-based platform who are anxious. And it really depends on how they're anxious in the situation. So most of the time we are seeing kids avoid being present on Zoom or web-based platform, avoiding participating. And so we can find, the key is for any of these things to find the first manageable step, that first thing that you can do. So first, maybe they join by chat and they can message you directly in chat. And then they can message the whole class in chat. And then they can turn their camera on, but keep their mic off. And then they can turn their mic on for a time when like everybody says like, I don't know, good morning at the beginning of the day. So they're verbally participating, but not standing out. And then gradually kind of getting closer and closer to what their other students are doing. So we can think about breaking these. Yeah.
Kendra, I'm going to jump in here because we're getting some great questions from the chat that are directly related to this, some of these examples.
Oh, awesome.
So we've had a few people ask about how equity intersects with asking people to turn cameras on when in a web-based meeting. In particular, somebody raised the great point that sometimes having this is just as a broad expectation fits within white supremacist ideals that has this expectation that people of color need to be monitored and how that's inequitable. And I think, I really appreciate that there's a lot of context here in this one question example, because this is a perfect example of kind of going back to that initial decision tree. And when Kendra's talking about some of these examples about how you can support engagement and getting students working towards having their camera on, that's when we've already made the decision that this makes sense for that student. Some of the questions that are being raised with regard to equity for students who might have concerns about privacy or safety, if they're attending their class in a shared space with other family members, that's a situation where I would say exposure doesn't necessarily make sense here. We want to understand, is it anxiety? Is it problematic anxiety that's getting in the way of them turning their camera on, or is it some other reason? And if it's some other reason, that's a perfect example of when you would use that decision tree and say, oh, this doesn't make sense for an exposure in this particular moment. Just wanted to jump in there since we had these great questions coming in.
Thank you, Jen, for monitoring the chat while I'm talking. And I think that's such an important point because there is no blanket approach to exposures for youth. It has to be personalized. And just as Jen pointed out, part of that personalization is understanding the other contextual factors that help you decide, is this an exposure to go after or not? So it has to be personalized, and we 100% must consider those contextual factors around safety and equity as we consider how to move forward. It makes this a longer process. It makes this a more effortful process, but that effort is so important. And just in doing the deep dive and challenging our own assumptions about what should or should not happen, and really going to the family to get that information. So thank you, Jen, for pointing that out. I think that's so key. Okay, so what we want you to, so again, I'm still working under the assumption that we have made the decision that this is an appropriate exposure to go after. We should be helping them face their fears. So what we would want you to say in that situation is, I know this is hard. I'm so proud that you're trying. And we want you to celebrate every small step, recognize what they are doing, even though they feel anxious, rather than what they're not doing. And that's really key because that can also help them identify, okay, so while I did this, here might be that next step. So again, for students who are having trouble participating by Zoom, start by reinforcing their attendance. Even if they're not on camera or quiet, they're still showing up. And so noting that like, hey, you're here, thanks for coming again. And then, coming up with a plan in collaboration with them on the side of like, what might be the next step? Because I know this is really hard and I know you can do hard things. So the collaboration can't be understated. And that's what helps you build that assessment at the beginning to make sure that this is an exposure to go after. And that collaboration is going to be just so key for you all in terms of making sure that we're aligned in terms of what our goals are and what that next step is going to be in the plan, so that everybody is working with the same set of expectations and you know exactly what you're looking for from that student to do next, and they know exactly what's expected of them as that next step. Breaking these exposures down into smaller steps can help things feel much more approachable to youth who are anxious, who might look at an anxiety-provoking situation really globally and is like one monolithic block, like, oh, there's no way I could possibly climb this mountain. But if we break it down into steps and stations along the way, it makes it feel much more approachable. Okay, so we wanted to talk a little bit more about anxiety and 504s and IEP plans. Because we got a lot of questions about this last time, and appropriately so. These are tools that are built to help everybody in this situation. And so we have some tips here for you. And one tip is that whether they are accommodations in an IEP or 504 plan, or whether that is the goal within the IEP, they should not include accommodations for avoidance. IEP goals might be stated, or even the accommodations, to be fair, might be stated in a way where where a student isn't doing, like, they're not kind of jumping in the deep end right away, but the language is such that we're starting in one spot. We're starting with just showing up. And here's how we're going to work on increasing expectations over time with progress. because we're expecting anxiety to change. Anxiety is dynamic, and the plan should be dynamic in response. We should not hold anxiety to static accommodations. We don't want accommodations that say, like, don't call on this student, don't talk to this student because it makes them feel anxious. Those are inappropriate accommodations, contraindicated, I should say. We should include practice approaching in these situations. And there are some examples listed here around saying your name, turning in assignments on time if there are mistakes, different things like that. But I just can't emphasize enough that there is no standard set of accommodations or goals. And this might be the most frustrating thing we say the entire webinar. I wish I could just hand you all, like, here's my template, just use this. And I really don't have that because these plans need to be so personalized for the youth that are involved. These plans need to be personalized for their specific fears or worries, how those things are impacting their performance in school. It needs to be personalized given, like, all of that assessment Jen was talking about up front in terms of the contextual factors that might be influencing the pattern that we're seeing, what we're approaching, what we're not approaching, because we've deemed this like not an appropriate exposure, not due to problematic anxiety, but a more systemic problem that's happening. So these plans just must be personalized. I wish I had a shortcut or an easier way, but the key is thinking about breaking down the situation into steps and describing a plan that talks about how, like, what might be some of the steps in between and how teachers and parents or other caregivers are going to be collaborating to communicate about what is or is not happening in terms of what our goals are, setting goals, including the student in that if that's appropriate given their age, how that's going to be reinforced. So I can use a selective mutism example. And a selective mutism is an anxiety disorder where youth can speak, but they are not speaking in situations outside typically their home or other settings where they're very familiar. And so the IEP or 504 plans for youth with selective mutism, the most successful ones, read something like, the plan is to increase, the goal is to increase verbalizations in the general classroom setting from 0 out of 30 times or whatever to, 28 out of 30 times or whatever the goal is. And here's what we're going to do. Like, we're going to set weekly goals. We're going to use a school to home note that lists the goal, teacher or other support systems in the school, like the counselor, speech language pathologist, whoever is involved in the team, are going to set up regular opportunities for the child to meet that goal every day. We're going to record, just a tally mark of, like, did they meet their goal or versus the number of opportunities that were given. And we're going to send that home every day, and that's how we're going to communicate to parents. And then parents are going to email back when it's time to change, or, parents in the teaching team will email about times to change the goal, to move it up a step. So that might mean that the student starts with, whispering one word one-on-one with a teacher or other educational support person in the school setting. And then once we've mastered that, it's like, okay, now we're going to practice turning our voice on. Now we're going to work on 2-word phrases. Now we're going to work on adding in a peer. And students can be so helpful in terms of helping us order our goals because we want them to be engaged in that. So this really is a partnership. So now we're going to take some time to answer some of your questions. So Jen, I'm going to let you go up first because you've been monitoring the questions, and I'm going to let you answer some while I take a read myself.
Sounds good. Okay, so sorry, I'm just trying to scroll through here, seeing there's some kind of common themes of questions that we're seeing. A few general requests for resources, and I just want to kind of generally respond. We've gotten some very specific requests about resources, both resources that we've embedded within our own slideshow. For example, that exposure decision tree, that is from a resource that Kendra and I are actually co-authoring with a collaborator at Seattle Children's. So we would be happy, we will get all of these questions at the end of the meeting today, and we'll have a chance to provide some additional resources related to those questions. So if you've had a general request about a resource, know that we've seen it and we'll have an opportunity to respond and provide some details.
And Jen,
similarly, yes.
Jen, if I can just chime in here and say that one of the things that we are working on as a part of this series is just a toolkit or some sort of guide that includes a list of all these resources that sort of culminates from these series. But I think something that we can do in the meantime is put together resources from the first session and from this session and put it into a document and get it posted on the site so that people can have access to those. So if you have the link to the page, which I think my colleague Megan has posted in the chat, you can keep an eye on that page for the resources. And we will also send out a newsletter type blast once we've posted those resources. So just want to rest assured, we will make sure that everyone has access to all of these amazing resources that Jen and Kendra are sharing with us.
Great, thank you for jumping in there, Kelsey. Yes, so one of the other questions that we've gotten from a few people and definitely came up during our last webinar too, was thinking about this overlap between anxiety and trauma. And I think about trauma as it would be defined for somebody who may meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, but not necessarily talking about the diagnosis specifically. And this is a case, unfortunately, I don't have a quick and easy answer to address some of these questions, because ultimately it does boil down to some of the comments that Kendra was making before about this is a great example of why it's helpful to have a full contextual picture of your student and what's going on. What I will say is that we know that avoidance is a significant symptom that causes significant impairment when people have anxiety, as we would think about it within a clinical anxiety diagnosis, such as generalized anxiety or OCD or social anxiety, and that avoidance is also a hallmark of trauma and related disorders such as PTSD. And what we know, while there are definitely additional skills that are needed, and this is where that context and making sure you have a clear picture of what's going on for your student is so important, that the strategy of addressing that avoidance, when the avoidance is about something that we ultimately need the student to do or what we want them to be able to do, whether it's avoidance driven by a trauma or whether it's avoidance that fits within the anxiety, that we're taking steps to approach it. And that's, again, a perfect example here, I think, of going back to, for somebody who's experienced a trauma, by definition, that means they were objectively at risk, they were objectively in danger. That means that when we're thinking about this accommodation, or when we're thinking about this approach and exposure process, even within a framework of somebody who's experienced a trauma, is that exposure, that facing the fear is not to put themselves objectively in the dangerous situation. It's that if the student, say something, they got in a car accident on their way to school, and the fact that it was on the way to school, they have a lot of avoidance about going to school, because when they even start to think about school, they think about that car accident and what the consequences of that. That is an example where we would think about, we would still want to support approaching getting back into school, because we know that ultimately that's going to be really helpful and super important for that student. But we're not asking them to put themselves in objectively dangerous driving situations, right? We're not asking them to get behind the wheel if they're eight years old. We're not asking them to walk out in the middle of traffic. What we're trying to target is the avoidance that's getting in the way of their functioning. And again, specifics of trauma-informed care and how to do this from a framework of student who might have PTSD extends well beyond some of the things we're talking about today. But this is definitely a theme that we're seeing, and we know there's been a lot of emphasis on making sure that we have trauma-informed schools, and wanted to talk about that today. Kendra, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add that, Jen and I had framed this talk to talk about problematic anxiety rather than focusing on specific diagnoses, because many times in the school setting, we're not necessarily talking about specific diagnoses. So to take it out of our like DSM clinical realm, and everything that we're talking about applies to clinical anxiety diagnoses like generalized anxiety disorder, adjustment with anxiety, separation anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, you name it, and extends down the spectrum. If we think about anxiety as a spectrum from like no anxiety to like the most problematic anxiety ever, like the highest level of clinical anxiety you could experience, and somewhere maybe around here is where we say, here and up is where we call this a clinical diagnosis. Everything that we're talking about in terms of anxiety intervention applies to that entire spectrum. So yes, it applies to anxiety, the many different anxiety disorder diagnoses. It applies when a student says that they're feeling anxious, even though they may not have an anxiety disorder diagnosis. In fact, if they're saying, I'm feeling anxious, they don't have a diagnosis, and we apply these skills, I would consider that to be early intervention for that student. That is prevention even. That's so key. So we could go into more about like when we call something like diagnostically a disorder or not. And I just want to emphasize the universal use of these skills regardless of diagnosis. And I think Jen's point is true. Like for all of this, we want to keep in mind where are the respective boundaries around risk, for like objective risk for these students. And especially when we're thinking about trauma, and where has that avoidance generalized to the point where it is impairing in their lives, where they can't do things that they need to do, the things that they want to do. We can start to work on that avoidance there. I just want to pick up some of the questions about relaxation strategies, because y'all know that's my soapbox. I would use, so we had a few questions about like, when would you recommend using relaxation strategies? Can we use it for other things? And I really want to, and can we use it for elementary school students for tools to develop for managing stress? And stress is just like such an, it's a word that it's like, stress, distress. It's a not very specific feeling term, I guess, is my issue with it. So we really want to help kids identify, like, what is it that they're feeling? Are you feeling anxious? Are you feeling frustrated? Are you feeling mad? Are you feeling sad? What are you feeling? We know that relaxation skills are contraindicated for anxiety, and we know that they can be helpful when youth are incredibly mad and frustrated, to help or when they are in a like suicidal crisis, like they're actually going to harm themselves in that moment, because those distress tolerance skills can help prevent them from doing something impulsive in the moment. Is it the ultimate intervention for managing those problems overall? No. But if the time when I could see relaxation skills being helpful is in those moments of crises, or when we're talking about like really, escalated feelings of anger or frustration, to prevent youth from engaging in a problematic, dangerous, impulsive behavior. Jen, passing it back over to you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so so many great questions coming through here on the Q&As. So I think one, Kendra started to talk about this, but one question that came up was specific to thinking about youth who might have symptoms of selective mutism, if not a diagnosis officially. Somebody asked if they're not already in formal treatment for that, is this an opportunity in the school setting to set some goals and work towards those? And I would say enthusiastically, yes, this is a great example of thinking about how if you have a good understanding of what this looks like, if you can start to support your student in taking some of these steps towards communicating or speaking in a way that that they have not been doing before. What we know, we see a significant increase in diagnosis of selective mutism when students start school, right? Because with these kids, they're at home and they're talking with their family members when they're in a comfortable environment, and they're frequently engaging and having these conversations. And it's when they get into school where we start to notice these challenges and some of this impairment. So if you are noticing it in the school setting, certainly that's an opportunity to start to practice some of those skills. And again, if this might be an experience where, as Kendra was saying, you are really taking this from a preventative approach. You're maybe catching this so early that you're helping change the course so that this student doesn't go on to develop a full diagnosis of selective mutism. Just as Kendra was saying, when we think about any of these symptoms of anxiety, when we think about whether they're the worries that come up with generalized anxiety, worrying about how well a student is doing, worrying about their own health or their family's health, worrying about making mistakes and things like that, whether it's the social worries that come up about worrying that they are going to do something silly or embarrassing, or people are going to laugh at them or judge them, regardless of kind of the specific type of anxiety that we're thinking about, if it is an anxious thought that's starting to get in the way, that is a perfect opportunity to apply some of these skills. So, I think about this as a great example of, as Kendra and I are speaking, of course, we are talking with you, we're responding. It's hard for us to fully anticipate what are some of the questions you're going to ask in the moment, and we want to be there and answer some of these great questions that are coming through. And what that means is sometimes we're stumbling over our words. If this was an experience where making that mistake put us in a situation where we just stopped talking and couldn't continue giving the presentation, or if I made a mistake in what I was saying and turned off my camera, that's a really quick sign. That's a quick avoidance where if we can intervene at that moment, if we could, get me back on the camera, get me to say it again, realize that, I misspoke there, I said the wrong word, or I made up a word in what I was saying to you, but I'm still able to continue speaking with you, and you're still participating and you're still asking these great questions. That's that learning experience that we want kids to have. And if we can have them get that learning experience from facing their fear, from engaging in the exposure sooner rather than later, then that only means positive things. We talked about this a little bit last time, but one of the things that I like to think about when we're talking about this idea of exposure, facing your fear, is really thinking about this as the coping skill for anxiety. I think often when we hear the term coping skills, that's when we start to think about things like relaxation or journaling or some of those other things that we've talked about that we know are not helpful for kids who are experiencing anxiety. But what is helpful for them is having that aha moment, noticing that urge to avoid in the moment, and then figuring out what's the small step they can take forward. So great questions, I think, that are coming in for this. And Kendra, wondering if you want to step back in.
Happy to. So I see some questions that have come up around panic attacks. And well, if you're not right, what do we do if our kids are having panic attacks? And you're saying steer away from relaxation strategies. So I am happy to address this question. So we still don't recommend using relaxation skills for panic attacks. In fact, using relaxation skills during exposures for panic attacks is contraindicated in terms of learning from that moment. What we do want them to do is ride the wave. And this sounds like it feels like you're doing less than maybe you feel pulled to do in that situation. But in that moment, I just want you to be there with the student as much as you may tricky how you actually are there with students these days, but to kind of coach them through like, hey, we're just going to ride this out. And one of the key things that I would do is to point out, like maybe collaborate with that youth. If you know, like, well, I know exactly who would have a trouble or who might have a panic attack in my class if I ask them a question or something like that. I would want to be in contact with that student to say, like, hey, I know this is hard. I know you can do it. What's a first small step we can take? And if we notice that they start to have a panic attack, I would want them to have some support either in that initial conversation or elsewhere, that like these feelings are normal. The catastrophic consequences we assume will happen from that elevated state of anxiety are untrue. And that they can ride this wave. Like there's a crest to this wave and then it comes down. So really when kids have panic attacks in my office, I'm sitting there going, you're here, you're hanging out here, just keep riding that wave. And I'm not going to change my expectation. I'm just going to sit there, watch how that wave goes, and then eventually come back to that. So if I put myself in the shoes of a teacher in class and I like pop on Zoom to say like, hey, Michael, will you answer this question number 4? And Michael starts to have a panic attack I'm going to say, let's like hang in there. Let's come back to that because we don't need to keep the spotlight on Michael while he's coping with a panic attack. We can come back to it and then chat with Michael privately, say like, hang in there, just ride the wave of that anxiety. You're still here. You're doing great. Going to come back to you. What goes up must come down. And then we come back to another opportunity in the future. Or say class ends, then I want to have a conversation with Michael afterwards to say like, hey, that was really hard. What's a small step that we think we can practice taking next time? So setting up that plan with them and maybe providing him with some quick psychoeducation about how anxiety is normal. These feelings really suck though. And we can ride them out. And the more we stay in the situation, the more that alarm that's going off goes, okay, so I'm going off, but there's no smoke. That like, I'm not actually dying. And like my, I'm living through the situation, I'm staying in it and I can do this. Versus if we say you have to use the relaxation strategies or you have to leave for a minute, then or leave the class or whatever, then we're saying the only reason I lived is that I got out of there, is that I avoided the situation. I avoided those feelings. I pushed them down. So really it's all about staying in the situation to ride the wave there. Jen, you want to come on back for the next question?
Sounds good. So I was just scrolling through here to see some of the questions that are coming through. There's one kind of comment and really important question that I think that came through on the chat about how we think about using the statistics that we presented previously about these inequities that we're seeing, about these disparities that we're seeing, and just thinking about how you might be able to help educate others within your school environment, depending on your role within the school system, thinking about getting connected with people more broadly within your community to highlight the fact that we are seeing these discrepancies in material resources, financial resources, and what that means for supports that can be put in place. When I think about school, and I was just talking to my senior class earlier this week about, when you think about school, how do you describe school? The idea is that it's this safe environment, that it's supposed to be a place where people can come together, where they can socialize, but they can also have some of their needs met. Schools are, the physical brick and mortar schools are such an important source of some of these basic social determinants of health that we talked about. And one of the challenges I think that is amplified in this current COVID context is the fact that some of these resources have been disrupted. So I think, this is, again, these resources, some of the specifics of where to find these statistics, we will provide as part of those resources, because I'm a researcher, clinician, and educator. So I always have the data hat on when I'm talking with different people and different audiences. And I find that having data can be really effective in having some of these conversations and figuring out how you can help educate others within your school community or within the broader community to figure out and better understand how some of these disruptions are impacting your students and directly impacting your students' learning. So I'm just scrolling through here. I think we might have,
Jen, I think there were some
Yeah.
opportunities for me to clarify some of the panic and relaxation points here.
perfect.
So I just want to say a lot of times there is concern around like, what will other people think about me if I have a panic attack? And most of the time, if we think about if we saw another person who is anxious, we would respond empathetically. Or, you know, often we find with teens that or people in general, to be fair, that it feels like people are thinking about us way more than they actually are. But I think we just want to help our youth use some skills to say, well, what actually happens, right? Even if people notice, what is so bad about that? Like, what are actually the negative consequences that are happening to that person in the situation? I think the more we say, like we help kids avoid so that other people don't see that that something is hard for them, the more we contribute to the stigma of mental health. So we just want to say, like, well, what could happen? Like, do we know for sure that people even notice? Like, I've certainly had people have panic attacks in anxiety group on Zoom, and a lot of times the other group members are totally clueless about what's happening, even if it feels so obvious to the person in the situation. So sometimes it's not that noticeable. So I think that's really important. I think that as you work with youth around panic attacks, a lot of questions have been around the distinction between relaxation and mindfulness and self-regulation. So I just want to note that, like, these things are not synonyms. Relaxation and mindfulness are distinct constructs. They're different things. So we actually use mindfulness all the time. We want people to be mindful of their physical experiences as they ride the wave. We want them to be aware of how it feels in their body, right? As they go up and as they come down. So mindfulness is awesome. It's just such a helpful tool, and it doesn't mean relaxation. So I think that's really key to point out. A lot of times those terms are conflated just in programs or how they're presented to families, but these things are actually really, really different. So mindfulness, the true definition of that is just like bringing non-judgmental attention to an experience. And for youth with anxiety, that's often the experience within their own bodies of feeling really anxious. And so self-regulation, I think of as one's ability. So it's not necessarily like being able to change like your physical experience. It's like all feelings are okay, but not all behaviors are, right? So you can feel really anxious and behave really differently. And the fact that we have to be in 100% control of every physical system in our bodies is unrealistic, frankly. And so I think these things are also really different. So if a youth is like, and I think that just points out the distinction in like what our target behaviors are when it comes to anxiety. So youth can be anxious, and they are often very anxious during exposures. If they're not anxious, we're doing the wrong exposure. But my job is not to like have them be not anxious and to regulate that down, but to say, you know, what you can regulate in this situation is what your behavior is, or like how, like what you do when you're anxious. So resisting engaging in problematic explosive behaviors when you're anxious, or throwing that book across the room because you got the answer wrong. So there are different target behaviors that we're after here. And I think that self-regulation is just super different from like what relaxation strategies as it comes to anxiety would go after. So I just wanted to make that distinction.
Great, and I'm seeing a question. This is a common question I made reference before, that Kendra and I are currently collaborating on these anxiety resources. So a common question of how do we take these strategies and think about them for teens. I love working with teens. It is so challenging and so rewarding. And one of my favorite parts about working with teens is the opportunity opportunity to be truly just authentic and irreverent. So the question that came in was asking about how do we support teens in engaging these strategies if they're not really open to it. So I start to think about what are the things that might be really important to them. Sometimes it's helping just connect the dots of if you know this student well and you know that they have big plans for after high school or big plans for what they want to do, if they want to go on to a specific degree program, if they want to pursue culinary school, if they want to work in a specific field, is using the information and what you know about that student to connect what you're seeing now in the moment to their bigger picture plans. Help them see that what's getting in the way for them right now has a direct impact on those future plans, and that's why you might want to help them. And if that's not as successful, or if you're really struggling with that, that's where, again, I think where some of that irreverence comes in. You might just talk about, it sounds like a lot of people are asking you about this, or they're kind of writing you about this, giving you some trouble about this. Maybe a way to get them off their back is by working on some of these things, right? So really just kind of embracing where the teen is, what you might be able to connect for them that is going to be most important. I think, what we know about adolescents and teens, particularly when they have educators, when they have parents, when they have peers, that there's a lot of competing demands, and that oftentimes teens are seeking out opportunities to kind of make decisions for themselves. And this is where using some of those kind of motivational interviewing strategies, if you will, helping them kind of identify what are the things that are getting in the way for them right now, and how might that be maybe more irritating to them. So if it's difficulty engaging in school and that's leading to a lot of parental conflict, really connecting it for that and talking about how maybe working on some of these strategies could be helpful in addressing some of those things. I am mindful of time, so I want to make sure that we save that time for everybody to complete those surveys, which are so helpful to us and to Kelsey and the broader team. And please know that we do collect all these questions, and we do have, as Kelsey's about to share, the upcoming round 3 of this webinar series planned.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. First of all, I want to offer my thanks to Dr. Reed and Dr. Blossom for this amazing second session, and for all of our participants. I failed to note as we started that we had nearly 350 people, if not more, on this session, which is a pretty big turnout. So we appreciate all of you taking the time to be on today. We also want to make sure that you know how to reach out to us. I want to say a huge thanks to Megan Lucy and Natalie Flores, who work behind the scenes for these webinars, but certainly are completely out front when it comes to the production and post-production and coordination and organization. So here are some ways that you can reach out to us, and we hope that you will take advantage of the free resources that we have available on our website. And as a reminder, as Jen said, we have part 3 that will be an interactive Q&A. We have the reminder for, again, another thank you, and a reminder for part 3. We'll also, in the meantime, be working on the video production. We'll get that posted within about a week. We'll post some resource documents for some of the great information that was shared today. And if you have questions or need additional support, please reach out to us.